Chapter 6. Return to the Gold Coast. In the enthusiasm for my plan of calling at every possible port along the West African coast, I had overlooked the fact that the boat I was on and the others that I would later join were on their normal runs and were hardly likely to accommodate one third-class passenger by cruising leisurely along the coast in order that he could disembark to sow the seed of Pan-Africanism. It was with immense chagrin, therefore, that I found we were not scheduled to call at the Gambia and that the first port of call was Freetown, Sierra Leone. When the boat docked at Freetown, I disembarked, taking with me only a small suitcase. I waved goodbye to Kojo Botsio, who, as a schoolmaster returning to take up a teaching post at Akim Abuakwa State College in the Gold Coast, had kindly offered to include my luggage, mostly books, with his. By this time, Wallace Johnson had returned to Freetown, and as he had little room himself, he arranged for me to stay with a friend of his. There was quite a lot of disagreement in the country over Wallace Johnson, who was chairman of the West African Youth League. I realized that the first important step was to endeavor to sort out this difference of political opinion and to get concerted action. I therefore asked for a private meeting with all the political leaders, and after much discussion and airing of views, we managed to come to some sort of agreement as to how the leaders in Sierra Leone could form a united front and work together for West African unity. During my 2-week stay in the country, I addressed a large audience at the Wilberforce Memorial Hall, several mass meetings both in Freetown and in the Protectorate, and also the students at Fora Bay College. I made some important political contacts and felt that my visit had been a success. From Freetown, I journeyed to Monrovia, the capital of the Republic of Liberia. Here, the political atmosphere was different. I began to wonder whether Liberia, as an independent country, would think seriously about a West African conference. I had already met Masters Edwin Barclay and William Tubman when, as President and President-elect respectively, they visited the United States. That was the first time I had ever seen Africans who were heads of state, and I was greatly impressed and encouraged. In those days, we looked upon Liberia as a symbol of African redemption, and it was the only independent African state, in spite of the fact that nobody ever said anything good about the country. To be like Liberia, in fact, was then considered to be the worst thing that could befall any country. I must say that in 1947 I could see the foundation for such sayings. I was not impressed at all with what I saw of Monrovia. However, when I visited the country again 5 years later, the place had changed so greatly that I could hardly recognize it. President Tubman had certainly lost no time in introducing many long overdue administrative, economic, and social reforms, all of which have greatly contributed to the advancement of the Republic. Unfortunately, when I landed in Monrovia in 1947, Mr. Tubman, who was then president, was away on trek, and because my boat was due to sail after only a 2-night stop, I could not wait for him to return. I was disappointed, but I managed to see several politicians with whom I discussed my mission. The general impression seemed to be that since Liberia was an independent state, it might be difficult for her to send a delegate to a conference composed solely of representatives from territories of colonial status. She might, however, send an observer. I then set sail for Takoradi in the Gold Coast, this being the next port of call on the scheduled run. I travelled as a deck passenger and incognito. I had enough experience of the efficiency of the British police to know that my embarkation at Liverpool would have been notified to the port authorities at Takoradi, together with a dossier of unsavory facts about my alleged communist associations in London. And I did not believe in meeting trouble halfway. The less my fellow passengers and the crew knew about me, therefore the better it might be. Without disclosing my name, I mixed freely with the other passengers and the crew boys, and we had a most enjoyable trip. At Takoradi, the immigration officers had to be faced. Hesitantly, I approached one of them. An African, with downcast eyes, handed him my telltale passport. The name written in the little white docket at the top suddenly seemed to me to have assumed the most enormous proportions. As the officer held the passport in his hand for so long without opening it, I raised my eyes, prepared to meet the worst. He was looking at me in amazement, his eyes protruding from his head. Then his mouth moved slowly and he whispered softly, "So you are Kwame Nkrumah?" I nodded. The game, I felt, was up. He beckoned me to follow him, and I did so. As soon as we had gone out of earshot of the other passengers and officials, his whole manner changed. He shook my hand enthusiastically and told me how they, the Africans, had heard so much about me, that I was coming back to my country to help them, and that they had been waiting anxiously for my arrival day after day. He told me to go on my way and that he would see to my papers and other formalities and return the passport to me in due course. It was wonderful to be standing once again on my native soil. I telephoned Mr. R.S. Blay, an Nzima lawyer living in Sekondi and a member of the United Gold Coast Convention, who came at once to collect me in his car and take me straight away to his residence in Sekondi. The following day, I left for Tarkwa to stay at the house of my good friend, Akar Watson. Akar Watson had been looking after my mother during my absence, and I had written to him from London, asking him to fetch my mother from Kuful to Tarkwa, as I felt that if I went to Kuful to see her, word was sure to get around that I was back, and I badly wanted some time with my mother and a short rest. To think both my mother and I received a shock when we first saw each other again after 12 years of separation. At least I did, when I realized that her sight was failing, and when I noticed with sadness that she had gone quite grey, and that with age she had lost much of her former beauty. She seemed smaller than I ever remembered her, perhaps because she had become frail. The first shock she had was when I smiled at her and she noticed my teeth. When I left, my two front teeth were divided by a fairly wide gap. In the United States, I found this a handicap because whenever I made public speeches, it affected my delivery, especially where the S's were concerned. I therefore decided to have them removed and replaced by two false ones. The idea that one could have teeth removed and others put in their place was quite foreign to my mother, and when she missed the gap between my two front teeth, she began to wonder whether I was really her son. Then, to assure herself, she examined my hands, for she always said that she would know me anywhere by my hands. I suppose one would say that they are somewhat delicately made for a man, and the fingers are rather unusual in that they are the same thickness all the way up. This makes it impossible for me to keep a ring on them. As soon as she had convinced herself that this was her prodigal son, her hitherto wonderfully controlled emotions broke through the barrier, and as she clutched me to her, I felt her body vibrate with deep sobs. And then, like an English April day, the sun suddenly took over and we both laughed with joy. We drew up two wooden stools and lost no more time in filling in a 12-year gap by recounting to each other all that had taken place in our respective worlds. She never asked me, and I never told her, the reason for my sudden return. Neither did I discuss with her my political ideas for the future. During that fortnight at Tarkwa, I was able to rest and to take stock of affairs. It was undoubtedly a period of political ferment throughout the world. The colonial liberation movement was having its effect in China, Burma, India, Ceylon, Palestine, Indochina, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and it was having its effect also in West Africa and on the African students abroad. Even though there were no overt signs of political unrest in Africa, the several territories were seething under the surface. The Gold Coast, for instance, was at that time considered to be a model colony, well behaved and well conducted. Little did the world realize then that this peaceful country was shortly to become the spearhead of African regeneration and renaissance. In the Gold Coast, the gap between the African intelligentsia on the one hand and the governor and the colonial government on the other had widened. During Gugisberg's administration, the nomination of chiefs to the Legislative Council and the setting up of a Provincial Council of Chiefs provoked the remnants of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society, who strongly opposed these measures. Between the administration of Gugisberg from 1919 to 1927 and that of Sir Alan Burns between 1941 and 1947, a great political awakening took place in the country. The system of indirect rule, that is, government by officials through the chiefs, accentuated by the depression of the 1930s, was having its repercussion, and the Gold Coast African was beginning to think seriously about the political and economic problems facing his country. With this dawning of political consciousness, Burns, like Gugisberg before him, started to introduce various political reforms that he believed to be necessary. He appointed Africans to the Executive Council. Although this was generally welcomed, a section of the intelligentsia were opposed to it because they declared those who were appointed to the Executive Council were either chiefs or people who were generally known to be favorable to the administration. A constitutional memorandum endorsed by the Joint Provincial Council of Chiefs and the Ashanti Confederacy Council was accordingly forwarded to the Secretary of State. Its recommendations, however, were not accepted, and in October 1944, Burns told the Legislative Council that the Colonial Office had approved the new constitution, which he had prepared in consultation with the chiefs and other African members of the Legislative Council. This was known as the Burns Constitution, and although it was hailed by some as being a big step forward towards self-government, the politically awakened section of the community soon became disillusioned and set about agitating for its abolition. The intelligentsia, having been successful in creating opposition to the Burns Constitution, now began to plan the launching of a political movement which could upset it. The idea of a political party as such never occurred to them, and the party system was alien to them. In fact, one of my numerous so-called crimes, according to my political opponents, is that I have introduced the party system into the country. It was at this juncture that the United Gold Coast Convention was born at Salt Pond on the 29th of December 1947. To ensure that by all legitimate constitutional means the control and direction of the government shall within the shortest time possible pass into the hands of the people and their chiefs, it is of vital interest to note here that Dr. Dankwa, one of the vice presidents of the UGCC, supported the Burns Constitution so strongly at first that he allowed himself to be nominated by the Joint Provincial Council of Chiefs as their representative in the Burns Legislative Council. Soon after that, however, the Kibi ritual murder took place. When Paramount Chief Nana Sir Ofori Atta I died, Akia Mensa, thought to be his son, was brutally murdered in cold blood. It was alleged that other members of the family wanted to get rid of him so that they could avail themselves of the property of the chief. The act was wrongly interpreted as a ritual murder, a stupid custom which used to be observed on the death of chiefs, when a number of innocent men were slaughtered in order to pacify the spirit of the departed chief. The trial of this murder case resulted in the sentencing to death or life imprisonment of sons and relatives of the late Nana Sir Ofori Atta, who was supposed to have been implicated in the crime. This led to an acute difference between Burns and Dankwa, who was a half-brother to Nana Ofori Atta, and therefore he withdrew his support from the Burns Constitution and started agitating for a new one. Because of the UGCC at the beginning lacked the support of the masses and of some of the chiefs, it is not difficult to see why it failed to make much impression. It was in an effort to make it appear a popular movement that I was invited to become its general secretary. Just before I left Tarkwa, I held my first public meeting in the Gold Coast in the Roman Catholic schoolroom there. I spoke for some time and told people of my experiences abroad and the reason why I had returned to the Gold Coast as Secretary General of the United Gold Coast Convention. The room was packed, and it was the first time that I had addressed an audience since my return to the country. For their absorbed interest and their acclamation, I sensed that they, a representative gathering of the working class of the country, were indeed ready to support any cause that would better their conditions. From Tarqua, I journeyed to Salt Pond in order to meet the working committee of the United Gold Coast Convention. The members received me enthusiastically and made many speeches of welcome before we finally settled down to the business at hand. The first item on the agenda was my appointment as General Secretary. This, it was agreed by everybody, should be confirmed forthwith. When the question of salary arose, however, there was a diversity of opinion. The £100 a month and the car had obviously, I realized, been used only as a bait, for I soon discovered that the convention, which itself lacked any kind of program or mass organization, had no funds at all and had not even attempted to open a banking account. As the payment of £100 was quite out of the question, they compromised by offering me £25 a month instead. I realized then that even this sum was going to be difficult for them to find, and I proposed that I would work for nothing so long as they would take care of my board and lodging expenses. The whole roomful of them turned to look at me in astonishment. As each one was making the income of around 2,000 to 3,000 a year, they must have thought I was either a pretty queer character or that in a shrewd way I was trying on something too clever for them to see. Later on, when they knew me better, it became a standing joke with one of the members in particular that I was quite indifferent to money and never understood the value of it. At that time, however, they couldn't make me out. They obviously intended taking no chances, for they would not agree to my proposal and insisted on paying me £25 a month. It mattered little to me, one way or the other, and I accepted their offer. In January of the next year, therefore, I began my official duties as General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention. I was made to understand that every effort was going to be made by the convention to abolish the Burns Constitution, but I was not told what kind of constitution they had planned to replace it. The following 2 weeks I spent in organizing an office. Once more, I set out on a room hunt and eventually managed to hire an old office of the United Africa Company, the biggest British firm in West Africa. I managed to secure the services of a typist, and in a few days got the office fairly well set up. The first thing I did was to call a meeting of the working committee of the convention on the 20th of January 1948. At this meeting, I laid before the members for their consideration the program which I had drawn up for the organization of the movement. This included the following points: Shadow Cabinet. The formation of a shadow cabinet should engage the serious attention of the working committee as early as possible. Membership is to be composed of individuals selected ad hoc to study the jobs of the various ministries that would be decided upon in advance for the country when we achieve our independence. The cabinet will forestall any unpreparedness on our part in the exigency of self-government being thrust upon us before the expected time. Organizational work. The organizational work of implementing the platform of the convention will fall into 3 periods. The first period, coordination of all various organizations under the United Gold Coast Convention, i.e., apart from individual membership of the various political, social, educational, farmers, and women's organizations, as well as native societies, trade unions, cooperative societies, etc., should be asked to affiliate to the convention. The consolidation, this is point B, the consolidation of branches already formed and the establishment of branches in every town and village of the country will form another major field of action during the first period. Point C. Convention branches should be set up in each town and village throughout the colony, Ashanti, the Northern Territories, and Togoland. The chief or Odikro of each town or village should be persuaded to become the patron of the branch. Point D. Vigorous convention weekend schools should be opened wherever there is a branch of the convention. The political mass education of the country for self-government should begin at these weekend schools. Second period. to be marked by constant demonstrations throughout the country to test our organizational strength, making use of political crises. Third period. Point A. The convening of a constitutional assembly of the Gold Coast people to draw up the constitution for self-government or national independence. Point B. Organized demonstration, boycott and strike, our only weapons to support our pressure for self-government. This was approved in principle, although there was a later denial by the members before the Watson Committee, and I was asked to get the organization going in full swing. When I first read through the draft constitution of the United Gold Coast Convention, I was struck by the fact that the Working Committee only intended concerning themselves with the colony proper, and to a less degree with Ashanti. The Northern Territories and Transvolta/Togoland did not feature in their program at all. I felt most strongly, however, that a united movement should embrace the whole country, and I was pleasantly surprised when my recommendations, including, as they did, plans for the organization of each of the four regions, the Northern Territories, Ashanti, the Colony, and Transvolta/Togoland, were accepted without comment. They probably felt that although I could not hope to succeed, there was no harm in trying. At a subsequent meeting, we discussed the colours for the convention and a suitable design for its flag. The lawyers present argued that it was an offence in law to fly a party flag. They went to great lengths in an endeavour to prove their point by quoting selections of the statute on the subject. I disagreed wholeheartedly and asked them if in other dependent territories this was allowed, what the objection would be in our particular case. I supported my case with facts, quoting the names of parties in other countries, as nobody could find any form of defense to put up against this. I won the day. We decided without much difficulty that the party colours should be red, white, and gold. I then suggested that the emblem might be a soaring eagle, representing the emergent Ghana. As this was not acceptable to Dankwa and his two relatives, William Ofori-Atta and Akufo-Addo, I asked them to suggest an alternative. At the following meeting, Dankwa produced his design for an emblem for the new state of Ghana. I was completely taken aback when I saw it, for he had depicted an animal with two heads and one stomach, which, according to the African, symbolizes selfishness, a lack of interest in others, in short. This was hardly in keeping with what I had imagined the UGCC had been founded for. Fortunately, there was a division of opinion and they failed to come to an agreement. So the hideous monstrosity was never adopted. When I took up my appointment as General Secretary, I found, on going through the minute book, that 13 branches had been formed throughout the country. On looking further into the matter, however, I discovered that this was entirely incorrect. In actual fact, just a couple of branches had been established and these were inactive. I saw at once the urgent need for a countrywide tour with the object of setting up branches of the UGCC in every part of the country. The results of this were most successful. For within 6 months I had established 500 branches in the colony alone. I issued membership cards, collected dues, and started raising funds in one way or another for the organization, so that in a short while I was able to open a banking account on behalf of the working committee. The organization and building up of a political movement in the Gold Coast at that time was no easy task. It called for much intensive travelling and the roads in many cases were just bumpy tracks. Things might have been a bit better if I had a more reliable car, but the ancient model that was supplied to me rarely finished the journey. It usually meant that I had to leave it with the driver while I continued my trek on foot. Sometimes, if a mammy lorry happened to be rattling past, I managed to get a lift, but I was not always lucky in this respect. Most times I managed to arrange things so that I spent the night in one of the villages, but on several occasions, when I had got stuck too far out in the bush, by nightfall I was obliged to sleep on the roadside. During those days, all my worldly goods, 2 suits, 2 pairs of shoes, and a few underclothes, could be easily stored in one small suitcase. This considerably facilitated my movements, especially as most of the time I had to carry my case myself. I travelled extensively to every corner of the country, holding rallies, making contacts, and delivering hundreds of speeches. I was not surprised to find a feeling of discontent and unrest among the people, for while I was editing the New African in London, I came across many African soldiers who had served during the war in Burma and the Middle East. They had become fully conscious of the inferior standard of living, and when they returned to the Gold Coast, they lost no time in seeking better conditions. This, together with a feeling of frustration among the educated Africans who saw no way of ever experiencing political power under the existing colonial regime, made fertile ground for nationalist agitation. It was consciousness of political and economic hardships and the social unrest after the war that led to the crisis in February and March 1948. It was while I was staying with my mother at Tarkwa that the news reached me that a certain sub-chief of the Gar state, Kwame Nkrumah, had organized a countrywide boycott of European and Syrian merchants in order to force the foreign shopkeepers to reduce the exorbitant prices of their goods. This movement, which was supported by many chiefs in the country, was intended as an anti-inflationary measure by the common people. A meeting was held at Tarkwa at which Nibon spoke. I was not able to attend the meeting myself, but I received a full report of what took place. My first reaction was that in spite of the weakness of the organization in its planning and methods, here at least was an attempt to give voice to the dominant political wishes of the people. The boycott soon spread to other towns in the colony and in Ashanti. It lasted for about a month and was conducted peacefully without any violence or disruption. It was then called off. When Bon first launched his campaign, I had only just returned to the country and had not even taken up my appointment as General Secretary of the UGCC. During the month that followed, I was so preoccupied with setting up an office in Salt Pond and organizing the various branches of the convention that I had no time to take part in the boycott, sympathetic though I was. However, my arrival in the country, my almost immediate appointment as General Secretary of the UGCC, and its boycotting campaign was so synchronized that although the events were coincidental, it was easy to understand why the government and my political opponents readily associated me with the campaign. It was generally believed, in fact, that I was its instigator. Nibon and his supporters in the boycott had never been members of the United Gold Coast Convention, and I was therefore quite certain that the campaign had nothing whatsoever to do with the UGCC. But in all fairness, it must be said that our agitation for self-government, we would not have been against taking advantage of any grievance that presented itself by so doing it could further our political purpose. On the 20th of February 1948, I delivered my maiden speech in Accra. When I addressed a large meeting at the Palladium, I had to drive from Salt Pond, and as usual, my decrepit car broke down. Luckily, after a time, we managed to get it going and it delivered me safely, though long after the scheduled time, at the Palladium Cinema, which was often used for rallies and meetings. I was a little anxious as I thought that the people might have got the idea that I was not coming, and that they might have left the place already. But there they were, waiting patiently in their thousands, curious and expectant. I addressed them on the ideological battles of our time. After I had finished, I realized more fully than ever, from the reaction of the crowd, that the political consciousness of the people of the Gold Coast had awakened to a point where the time had come for them to unite and strike out for their freedom and independence. It was at that meeting that Dankwa, in supporting my speech, told the crowd that if all the leaders of the UGCC failed them, Kwame Nkrumah would never fail them. On the same day that the boycott was called off, on the 28th of February 1948, it just so happened that there was also a peaceful demonstration of the ex-servicemen's union. These two events were entirely disconnected, and it was a mere coincidence that they should have happened on the same day. I was certainly aware of the general dissatisfaction of the ex-servicemen, and I was acquainted with their union through my job as General Secretary of the UGCC. As a matter of fact, it had been my intention to organize them in due course, as an arm of our movement. I was fully aware that they intended to make a peaceful demonstration in order to bring their grievances before the governor, but neither I nor anybody else could have possibly foreseen that this demonstration would have such tragic results. The trouble began as the contingent of ex-servicemen approached the crossroads at Christiansborg, where the road branches off to Christiansborg Castle, the official residence of the governor. They had by now left the route prescribed, and when they arrived at the crossroads, they were commanded to halt by the police. They refused to do so, maintaining that it was a peaceful demonstration. This brought about a clash between them, during which the European officer in command ordered his men to open fire. As a result of this, 2 ex-servicemen were killed on the spot and 5 Africans were wounded. When the news of this shooting reached the business center of Accra, where hundreds of Africans were shouting for the first time since the lifting of the boycott, the people were quite naturally inflamed. In a matter of minutes, the whole town was in commotion. Africans started assaulting European and Syrian shopkeepers for failing to reduce their prices as had been announced earlier as part of the terms for calling off the boycott. Rioting and looting followed and continued for days. The news of these disturbances in Accra reached me on the same day that I was addressing a party rally in Salt Pond. A meeting of the executive committee was called immediately, and it was decided that I should proceed at once to Accra. Arriving there, I convened a meeting of the leading members of the Accra branch of the UGCC, and afterwards went around the town to see for myself what was happening. The reports that I had believed to be exaggerated were in fact an underestimation of the turmoil and damage that had been done. The looting and rioting seemed to be quite out of hand, and many buildings, including the large stores of the United Africa Company and the Union Trading Company, were on fire. As a result of this disorder, 29 people lost their lives and 237 were injured. Realizing that the situation was critical, I summoned a meeting of the executive committee in order to discuss the draft of a telegram which we had decided should be sent to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, who was then Mr. A. Creech Jones. I felt that a simply worded telegram to the point was all that was necessary to convey what we wished to say, but Dankwa thought otherwise. In the end, 2 telegrams were dispatched, a long one drafted by Dankwa and a short one drafted by myself. In these telegrams, we asked on behalf of the people and the chiefs that a special commissioner be sent out immediately to hand over the administration to an interim government of chiefs and people, and to witness the immediate calling of a constituent assembly. Although I realized that by this telegram alone we would not expect to destroy British imperialism in the Gold Coast, at the same time I considered it an opportunity not to be missed. While I was in Accra, a rumor reached me that the police were searching for the 6 leaders of the UGCC. Luckily, 2 women supporters offered to give me shelter until such time as I could leave Accra. They were untiring in their day and night watch, and in the way that they looked after for me. I stayed with them for several days with my small typewriter, and it was actually while in hiding in that house that most of the plans were laid that were later embodied in the program of the Convention People's Party. After a while, however, I realized that if I remained long in the house, I might endanger the lives of these women, and so after an emergency had been declared by the governor, and after the telegrams had been safely dispatched to the Secretary of State, I left Accra for Salt Pond.